From sunny St Leonard's on the south coast of the UK, this is the Keto Woman Podcast, brought to you by me, Daisy Brackenhall. Hello Keto Lovelies, and welcome to episode number 206, where I'm joined by Megan Pfeffer for another Bitesize Nutrition episode. This week we're talking about, well actually I'm not going to tell you, I'll leave it as a surprise like it was for me. But I can tell you that I found it really interesting. The subject Megan is talking about is not something I knew anything about really. So I found it really interesting to learn all about this quite important thing that we should maybe be paying a little bit more attention to. But before we join Megan, let's have a quick roundup of what's been going on here. It's been quite a busy week for me. All of a sudden, I've got loads to do all at once. The guy is starting on Monday to do the floors. And of course, there's all sorts of DIY stuff that I should have done in that room over the summer, which of course I haven't done yet. So I'm trying to get all my editing out the way so that I can spend a few days just focusing on that. But of course, all sorts of things pop up that have taken up my time. So here we are at Thursday already, and I haven't got much of that DIY stuff done at all. So it's going to be a really busy couple of days. I've also had to try and schedule and coordinate an electrician and a plumber, but luckily they've been very amenable and working round the floor guy, which is great. I'm hoping to head over to see my mother in Worthing on Sunday, assuming I can get some fuel for my car, although I think I might just about have enough in the tank to get there and back. If you live in the UK, you'll know straight away what I'm talking about. If you don't, you might have seen on the news that we are going through sort of a fuel shortage. It's not really a fuel shortage. It's a bit like the toilet paper shortage. It's one that's been fired up by the media to start a desperate wave of panic buying. So there are queues all over the place and traffic jams, and it's all a bit of a nightmare. I was hoping it would be over by now, but it's been a week now already, and still people are acting a little bit crazily, to be perfectly honest. And of course, there are plenty of people that actually need fuel, so have got no choice but to drive around and then spend hours queuing up. Surely, at some point, all the people who are panic buying will have actually filled their cars up and won't keep going back, but who knows? The guy who was here doing the fence this week was telling me that there were people filling up fuel cans and all sorts. To be honest, I'm surprised they're actually letting people do that, but who knows? I'm not going anywhere near petrol stations unless I absolutely have to. And talking of the fence, that's done now, apart from one little section that we can't do until some work is done on the roof, which is also the walkway out to the garden. But it looks great, really pleased with it. And I can really start working on the garden now. And I put up some other structural elements, so it's really starting to take shape. So that's exciting. Despite having a fence around the end of the garden now, the foxes are still finding a way in. There are actually places where they can get underneath, although they do seem to be coming in a little bit less. I am still feeding them, but only a couple of times a week now, just to try and keep that balance between giving them some tasty things to eat and not encouraging them too much. Like I said before, the main reason is I don't want there to be an altercation with Rocket. He is a hunting dog after all, and I dread to think what will happen if the two come face to face in close quarters. I think that's all my news, really. I haven't had much of a chance to go swimming, but I did go yesterday evening at high tide when it was extremely choppy, and it was quite a challenge to stay upright getting in and out, but I managed it and was quite pleased with myself for that. As challenging as it can be when there's a lot of wind and it's choppy, it's good fun, bobbing up and down on the waves. The weather is definitely turning here now though, and it's getting decidedly autumnal. We had a glorious sunshiny day on Wednesday, but it's looking more and more overcast and the forecast is not good. So I think autumn is really taking hold now. Anyway, I think that's it for me, really. I need to go and get on and finish this edit and then do some DIY. I shall report back to you next week. Hopefully there'll be some big leaps forward when it comes to building work. I hope wherever you are in the world, you're heading into a fantastic weekend. But for now, let's get started with that Bitesize Nutrition episode. I'll see you on the other side. Welcome back, Megan, to another Bitesize Nutrition episode here on the Keto Woman podcast. It's great to see you today. How are you doing?
Hi, Daisy. I'm doing really well, thanks. It's so nice to be here with you again, and it's really great to see you. It's been a little while.
It has. Time goes very quickly, doesn't it?
It sure does.
Or it does. It seems to at the moment.
It really does. I think given that we're in lockdown at the moment, I think it's surprising that time can go so quickly, given that the world has sort of closed down, or our local world has closed down a bit, but time is flying by. I'm as busy as ever.
You have very dramatic and swift and harsh lockdowns over there in Australia, don't you? I don't envy you.
No, it's, there's certainly been a lot of them. I think we're the most locked down city in the world, or cities in the world, but it's keeping people out of hospital, so I guess that's a good thing. Yes,
very true, very true. It seems that every country is doing their own experiment of sorts, really. And it'll be in 10 years' time when we're watching a documentary about it all that we'll find out what the best way was to tackle it.
Yes, which will be so interesting, won't it, to actually, to see how it really has all played out.
It will be, yes, with all those benefits of hindsight that you're always saying, oh yes, should have done that, should have done this. But of course you don't know. In the moment, you don't have that benefit. So everyone's just sort of feeling their way, really. But anyway, I'm very excited because I have no idea what you're going to be talking about today. So take it away.
Okay, so today I wanted to talk about a not so well known nutrient that was only discovered less than 25 years ago. It's super important for many physiological and biological processes throughout the body, and it's estimated that as little as 8% of the population are getting enough of it. So this essential nutrient deserves to be more widely understood and appreciated because it plays so many fundamental roles in the body. And not taking enough of this nutrient can have some far-reaching health consequences, particularly for certain population groups and for babies in the womb. So the nutrient I'm going to talk about on today's Bite-Sized Nutrition episode is choline. So firstly, what is choline? It's a vitamin-like compound often referred to as the cousin of B vitamins, although it's not actually a B vitamin or a mineral because it doesn't function as a coenzyme. So choline is an essential nutrient, meaning we need to obtain it through our diet. The liver produces some choline, but not enough. And people who are more susceptible to inadequate choline levels include women during pregnancy, because choline is needed in higher amounts for the development of the brain and the nervous system in fetal development, which is the first system to develop in utero. And in fact, choline deficiency is linked to a higher incidence of neural tube defects and other problems such as cleft lip and palates. Women produce more estrogen and therefore more choline during pregnancy, but if dietary intake is insufficient, and especially if you have a genetic polymorphism or variance, slowing down the functioning of what's called the PEMT enzyme, then a pregnant woman may still be deficient, even though she's producing so much more estrogen and therefore more choline. Also, during post-menopause, there can be choline deficiencies or not getting enough choline because as estrogen assists in choline synthesis by activating that PEMT enzyme. So PEMT is an enzyme that you can have genetic variances with similarly to MTHFR, and so it can be fairly common in different populations of having that genetic variance. So it's interesting that can play a role in something like choline, and that estrogen really plays in with that as well. So I find that really fascinating. Other groups who are susceptible to choline deficiencies are if you are vegetarian or vegan, because the highest sources of choline come from eggs, organ meats, red meat and chicken, fish and dairy products. Or maybe you're just not eating enough protein, because we know that there are plenty of women out there that aren't eating enough protein, and our protein requirements increase as we get older. So that's really key as well. But I think this is a really a major area of concern, really, for vegetarians who aren't eating eggs, perhaps because eggs really are one of the best sources of choline. But even a lot of women who start keto and don't like eating eggs, or people who can't eat eggs, I think need to, I always recommend that women start the day with eggs, or that anyone starts the day with eggs. Ideally, if you enjoy eating eggs, or eat them at a different, eat them for lunch or whenever, but to have them, sometimes it's nice to have leftover for dinner, for brunch or for lunch or whatnot. But I really sort of encourage that predominantly you do include eggs. Otherwise, you have to sort of really sort of look into including enough of the other foods so that you do get those choline levels up.
So if you, in general, eat a diet that's fairly rich in animal protein foods, you're probably going to be getting adequate levels?
Well, if you're, like, for example, to get the same level as 1 egg of choline, you'd need to eat 6 ounces of chicken.
Interesting. So it really is a bit of a choline powerhouse then, an egg.
It is, absolutely, yeah. And that's why we say eggs are a nutrient powerhouse, because of the levels of nutrients in them, and choline is definitely one of them. And it's not really a nutrient that we're on the lookout for.
No.
For some reason it's not one that we're talking about much.
And how many, I know this is too general a question, because presumably it depends on the individual to sort of refine exactly how much they need, but how many eggs a day would you say on average would give you enough choline for your daily boost of choline? Would my 2 eggs a day that I have absolutely every day be sufficient, for example?
No. So an egg, 1 large egg is about 150 milligrams of choline, and you need about 425 milligrams of choline. Though in saying that, the liver we do actually produce choline ourselves. So again, that's going to come down to how well you're producing choline and what your age bracket is. So if you're postmenopausal, you're not going to be producing enough choline, so it becomes even more important that you get more through the diet. We don't actually produce enough choline to totally mitigate needing it through the diet, hence it being an essential nutrient. But yeah, those other factors can come into play as well. And so if you don't know how well your PMEMT enzyme is working, for example, so I really encourage people to get genetic testing where you can, because knowing those types of details are really key in then managing what nutrients, you need to be on the lookout for.
So this is another one that's going to be particularly relevant for anyone who's vegan, for example. That's
absolutely
something that they're pretty well automatically going to be verging on at least deficient if they're not thinking about other ways of getting it into their diet.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. And so that's why, quite often people will recommend, or certainly nutritionists will recommend to people, if you're vegan, to at least consider eating eggs. Because it does deliver so many nutrients, and in particular, choline is going to be much easier to get that through there.
They're just not going to want to do that, are they? Though that's the problem. Vegetarians, yes, probably not a problem, but vegans, I guess it depends what your reason is, what your value system is that means that you're vegan. But I would imagine that it's just not going to work.
Yeah, that's right. And the thing is, you can supplement the choline. So that's something that you can look at doing, because lecithin contains choline. And lecithin is used in a whole lot of products, and it's often used as an emulsifier. Yep. And so vegans could potentially be getting that, but obviously not in high amounts. So this is something that they're going to need to look at supplementing. The only problem with supplementing, of course, is that often it's going to be coming from soybean oil or canola oil or grapeseed oil, or one of those oils that really aren't ideal, that you really don't want to be consuming. So that's something that you then need to make sure, try to find one that is derived from eggs or animal products.
Sunflower lecithin you could use, I suppose.
Yeah, sunflower.
You might be going on to talk about this, but how would I know without testing, or would I not know without testing, if I wasn't getting enough choline?
Well, there's different symptoms that it's not necessarily something that you would actually know, although interestingly, one of the symptoms is fatty liver disease. Because choline is really involved in creating VLDL particles in the liver. So if you don't have the choline to create these VLDL particles to package out fat from the liver and transport that throughout the body, it's going to mean that you're having that fat retention in the liver. So fatty liver is definitely a sign of choline deficiency. We also know, of course, that there are other contributions. I mean, alcohol obviously can contribute to fatty liver, but also diets high in carbohydrates or high in fructose in particular can contribute to fatty liver, but also, and one that we don't hear about so much, choline deficiency being involved with fatty liver. So, and I don't think people look to that as a way to fix that. Now, that may even happen on its own, because when people go to low carb or keto, for example, or even paleo, they're often switching to eating a lot more eggs. They're switching from toast to eating eggs, and so they're naturally lifting, I think, that choline portion. But certainly for men and postmenopausal women are at higher risk of getting fatty liver, because they have, postmenopausal women and men as well have lower estrogen levels. And studies have shown this, that perimenopausal women have less risk, even in a choline deficient diet, still have a lower risk of developing fatty liver, because they have the higher estrogen in those times through, when you're in your fertile years, you're going to have that higher estrogen level. And so that can help to protect you from that effect. So it's more so when you get into postmenopause, or even makes me think of women who are taking tamoxifen and drugs like that are suppressing estrogen, people who have had estrogen sensitive cancers, breast cancer and things like that. So that's something to look out for there as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and it makes sense that if you were coming from a diet that was high in processed and refined foods, like you were saying, a very high carbohydrate diet, you're not going to be getting many of those choline rich foods, probably not very high proportion. So like you say, naturally when you switch to probably, well, not any, I guess, but an animal food rich, but a whole food diet, when you're switching to a whole food diet, that's naturally going to improve things somewhat, at least.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And then other symptoms of choline deficiency are things like feeling anxious or restless. So, I mean, that can be related obviously to a lot of things, so not something specifically, but things like muscle damage as well. It can cause muscle damage, and I'll just mention about the things of what choline is needed for, because I think once you see just how important this nutrient is, it really makes you want to think about it more. And also hyperhomocysteinemia, which is high homocysteine levels, and high homocysteine levels are implicated in cardiovascular disease. So that's another thing that a lot of people don't test their homocysteine levels. If you have abnormal blood lipid levels, for example, generally some people will want to test homocysteine. It's not often I see that test coming through from doctors ordering that test. I order homocysteine quite often, particularly for people who have low B12 and low folate levels, for example, or who have cholesterol levels, lipid levels that are dysregular. So interestingly, though, choline levels quite often will have low LDL cholesterol, because of that inability to package the VLDLs from the liver, means that you're often going to see the low LDL cholesterol. So things that choline is actually really important for, and I mentioned earlier about how choline plays a major role in fetal development, because it influences stem cell proliferation, meaning when the cells mature into other cell types. And this alters the structure and function of the brain and the spinal cord, and influences the risk for lifelong poor memory function, which is really interesting. That so in utero, what exposure you have to choline there is going to affect you later in life, your mental performance later in life, which I find is really fascinating. Choline is often included in prenatal supplements, although often made from soy lecithin, and not all supplements contain choline, but really should, and particularly if your diet's lacking. And so choline intake may also raise your risk of other pregnancy complications like preeclampsia, premature birth and low birth weight with low choline. Choline is also needed for cell signaling and to form the cell membranes that surround all of your cells and for the synthesis of DNA. So, this is something that affects every single cell in your body. Also, the brain and nervous system need choline to make the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which is used to control things like learning, memory, and mood. Acetylcholine is the chief neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic nervous system, and that's the part of your nervous system responsible for the rest, digest, and healing phases, and the part of the autonomic nervous system that contracts smooth muscles, dilates blood vessels, and regulates your heartbeat. Imbalances in acetylcholine are linked with other chronic conditions such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease.
That makes sense, doesn't it? If it's been impacting brain cells in the way that you were talking about before.
Yeah, when it's so intricately linked with brain and nervous function, and it's involved in, the myelin sheath, which is what surrounds your nerve fibers and helps with nerve signaling as well. And so choline is important for normal muscle function, for the lipid or fat transport, as we said, via the assembly of VLDLs. And insufficient choline can cause a fatty liver and liver damage, as we had said. In fact, the adequate intake recommendations they came up with were based on the amount required to prevent liver damage. So it's quite widely known for that particular consequence. And this is why it's kind of surprising that it's not more widely talked about, the fact that it can be so damaging. Choline is the major source of methyl groups in our diet, and methylation is really important for lots of things. And it can also contribute to heart health, as choline and folate both help to convert that homocysteine back to the amino acid methionine. And so if either of those nutrients are missing, choline or folate, homocysteine can increase, and that's then that independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease and also for strokes. And the demand for folate actually increases when the dietary supply for choline is limited, and vice versa. And a lot of people aren't getting a lot of folate through their diets either, or their microbiomes aren't sufficient enough to be producing these nutrients as well. So that's really interesting just how intricately involved it is for so many processes.
Yes, absolutely. And how it sounds like it's tied in so much to a lot of the things that people in the keto community are interested in and talk about. And it sounds a bit like it sounds like it should be another strand that is addressed and thought about along with all the others. But usefully, by the sounds of it, there are similar pathways to improve it as things, you're doing already, or certainly very similar.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I love about these particular ones where, we love using food as medicine. That's really, before going to supplements of any kind, unless there's a really severe deficiency going on, that you really want to be utilising food as medicine. And that's, even in the case, even in this case with choline. And of course, there are times of higher needs like during pregnancy, but the body does also compensate for that and produces more by upping estrogen levels, which then, helps to increase the production of things like choline, which is really helpful. So getting it through your food obviously is the ideal way to be doing it, as with lots of things. But we talked about how lecithin is turned into choline in the body, and that helps to make acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter I talked about. Also, lecithin supplements tend to only contain about 10 to 20% of phosphatidylcholine, it's called, when it comes in a lecithin supplement. So it has a really low percentage of choline that you're going to be getting it through taking a lecithin supplement.
Yes, that's often the problem with all sorts of supplements,
yes,
isn't it? It might have whatever milligram or whatever dose spread across the front, but you need to look at the small print to find out how much
absolutely, yes,
you're getting of the thing you're trying to actually boost in your system.
Yes, I mean, magnesium is a classic example of that because magnesium glycinate or magnesium citrate, you need so much of that to get the actual elemental magnesium that you're looking for. So that's always the case with things like this. You need to know how much of the phosphatidylcholine you're getting, or you can actually get phosphatidylcholine supplements as a pill or a powder. But, again, it only comprises about 13% choline in that supplement, so smaller amounts. So you're much better off getting it through your foods. And there are other forms of supplements that are better absorbed, which include choline chloride or CDP choline. And there's one called alpha GPC and betaine that you can look at as well. The requirements that we spoke about for women is typically 425 milligrams for 19 years and older. It's a bit less, only marginally less for teenage girls. For pregnant teens and women, it goes up to 930, and breastfeeding is about 550 milligrams. And for any women who are on drugs like methotrexate, it does increase the need for folate and choline, so that's something you need to consider as well. But there aren't any drug interactions as far as we know with choline, so there's no medication interactions.
So remind me then, if I was looking to get all the choline I needed from my food intake, what would my day look like? So I could have, if I had 4 eggs a day, that would do it in one fell swoop.
Yeah.
But say I don't want to eat 4 eggs a day. Say I want to get maybe half my choline with a couple of eggs a day. How am I going to be able to add up that required amount?
Yeah. So if you had a couple of eggs a day and you were having, say, 6 ounces of chicken or 6 ounces of beef would give you a couple of 100 milligrams of choline. You can also get it through scallops, salmon, and things like Brussels sprouts and broccoli will also give you some. So you could have by the time you have a chop, maybe a cup full of broccoli or sprouts. You would get some. You can get small amounts from things like peanut butter as well. But typically it's going to be those meat products. And also dairy products will have them in there as well. So as we were saying, that really, if you are eating enough protein type foods, animal protein type foods,
should be covered.
The chances are you're going to be getting enough. But then the only thing with that is that you want to make sure that genetically you don't have any variances there which are slowing down the ability to create within our bodies. So that's just something to keep an eye on as well.
So is it something that, if you're at all thinking that you might not be getting enough, is it something that we should be looking to take a supplement from? You've already mentioned that there are quite low amounts in supplements, so it sounds like that's not necessarily the easiest way to just boost your daily intake.
No, I don't think so, but we do recommend supplements for women who are pregnant.
Right.
Usually, as we're saying, to look out for a supplement that has choline in it, because your requirements go so much higher. And so even though the body is producing more, you do want to be getting it there. But if you're vegetarian or vegan, then yes, you really want to do your research of how much is in certain foods and work out if you're having those foods each day. And if you're not, then you really would need to be supplementing. Or as we said, if you're vegan, you're going to be deficient and you really need to be supplementing that, particularly if you're a postmenopausal vegan, even more so.
And if you have been relatively deficient for a long period of time, perhaps you were set up right from way back in the womb, and you mentioned the potential issues with development. Is it one of those things that you can boost your levels back up to a good amount with focusing on the right foods and potentially supplementing? Can you repair that damage? Or is it a case of just doing the best you can with where you're at?
Yeah, I think that's probably going to depend on, was it something that you were lacking in the womb? And look, studies obviously are still building on things like this. But if it's something that happened in the womb and they're saying that can affect you in the later years of life, then that is potentially something that you can't intervene in. But, I mean, the short answer is I really don't know, because perhaps there is. And does anyone know? I don't know. Have they even done enough studies, to actually know that, is the question. But there could be other things that, yes, potentially things that are happening that because, well, for example, fatty liver can be rectified by fixing that choline deficiency. So in that example, yes, you certainly can. So I would say that there would be some things and potentially no for others, but more studies are needed really to know that.
And of course, other things that you can do as part of a whole that are going to improve things or help in a preventative way against things like, memory deterioration, for example, something that a lot of us worry about. We already know things like cutting sugar out and how a ketogenic diet is good for that. So I guess, thinking about this, not freaking out too much about the fact that you might have been choline deficient for all your life and all the day. I can see some people getting a bit worried about it. But I think just thinking about it as part of a whole and just being aware of the foods that it's rich in and trying to include those in your daily intake as much as you can, especially eggs.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. And I think you're spot on when you say that you have to look at it in the context of the whole, because we also know that, like you were mentioning, that cutting down on carbs, which means lowering insulin and lowering inflammation in the brain, is going to really help in that area as well. So obviously, if you've got a lot of inflammation and high insulin going on in the brain, then that's going to be a compounded effect and perhaps make things a little more tricky.
Well, very interesting. Certainly not something that I've ever come across, really. When you talked about acetylcholine, I can remember reading a bit about that when I was reading about something else. But yeah, choline is definitely not something that's ever really been a focus. And it sounds like it's definitely something that you need to think about as part of a whole. Fascinating.
Yeah.
So is there anything that we haven't covered about choline?
I don't think so. I think that's been a pretty comprehensive look without going into too much detail about genetic variances and things like that. But I think we've managed to touch on a lot of the key points for people to have a think about.
Perfect. Well, that's, it's been very, very interesting. Thank you very much for that. So, you know how we end the show. What have you got for us regarding a top tip, please?
I think, as always, that being mindful that really getting variety in your diet is so key, and this is the reason why, because it's going to really give you every chance and opportunity to getting these types of nutrients in. And so I think trying not to discount food groups if you can. And if you do need to do your homework to have a look at what nutrients you're going to be missing out on and working out ways to get around that.
Yes. And unless you really don't like eggs, eat more eggs.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm very happy that eggs are very much a part of my daily routine. It's another reason why I can be glad that I eat eggs every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I love them. I'm very happy eating eggs every day. The more the better.
Yeah, me too. Well, thank you very much, Megan. It's been a great pleasure talking to you today, as always.
Okay, thanks, Daisy.
Thank you for staying with me right to the very end. I hope you enjoyed that and found it as interesting as I did. Who knew how important choline was? And hopefully, like me, you're an egg lover, so keeping those choline levels topped up won't be too much of a challenge. I thought it only fitting that I find a quote about eggs. And this one is one of those that's very obvious, but also very deep if you want to ponder on it. I've no idea who said it, but it's along those lines of you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. So here it is, this week's end quote from Unknown. You can't use an egg unless it is broken. Until next week, please take very good care, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye, Keto Lovelies.